today. Last week was just the basics of Marxist theories. Today, based on these like a pure theories of Marxism, which became structuralist perspectives, we need to get into more of applications of these Marxist theories, applications to how Marxism or structuralism later can be applied to like IPE in the 70s. We learned from the liberal perspectives that the 1970s was a turning point in the IPE structure. The 70s was important, right? 70s, U.S. power began to decline. Right? There was a rebellion. There was protest from developing countries. But then the 80s, U.S. began to rise again. The 90s, this is from liberal perspectives, right? This is how liberals view the IPE. 70s, U.S. decline, developing countries rose. 80s, U.S. came back. 90s, liberal campaign, globalization, launched, right? 2000 was a peak, but then globalization, 2000 suddenly faced a problem, right? Then financial crisis. So this is the, these are the subjects. Then liberals look at it differently. Mercantilism look at it differently. Today, using these basic materials of the IPE, the 70s, 80s, 90s, we need to apply structuralism. How would structuralists view these different periods? That's the point. That's the focus of today's class. Right? How would structuralists, view like a liberal interpretation of the 70s, liberal interpretations of the globalization period, things like that. Very interesting. Second segment of this chapter is quite interesting. A lot of relevance to contemporary IPE. Good section. This second section of chapter 4. Good section. We need to begin with Lenin. Lenin's imperialism. The place of Lenin and his book title, which came out 1917, his book, Imperialism. That's his book title, Imperialism. Subtitle, Highest Stage of Capitalism. That's the subtitle. So from Lenin's perspective, imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. When capitalism develops, imperialism comes. That's Lenin's contribution. So he expanded Marxism to become more international type of imperialism. That's Lenin's contribution. So, which became very important to modern, contemporary structural IPE perspectives. So Lenin made a huge contribution to IPE. His focus was on Russia. He looked closely at how capitalism evolved in Russia. In his view, capitalism in Russia at that time, early to 20th century, reached a critical point. Okay, capitalism reached a high stage. Then he develops Marxist theory further, then argues that there will be another stage in historical development. After capitalism, when capitalism reaches highest stage, then socialism comes. Right? And Russia, by that time, was just about to be ready for this jump to next stage, right, after capitalism. Then I think his like a theory of imperialism, and his theory of imperialism is global capitalist theory, right? That's imperialism. Global political economy in modern terms. He began to develop so-called the international capitalist sort of a theory, which is real global IP, right? Then he argues that there are two kinds of groups. There are core groups, like advanced core states. And he didn't quite use non-core periphery, but there are cores and colonies, right? Then these cores exploit these colonies. Right? This is the beginning of all, theories that followed, right? And monopoly, this is important. Highest stage, when capitalism reaches a highest stage, monopoly settles. Monopoly. What's the monopoly? Monopoly means exactly this: the centralization of power, market power, economic power, into the hands of very few people. This is monopoly capitalism. So his theory is a study of capitalism, really, right? Domestic capitalism then expanded to become an international capitalism. So he looked at both sides, right? Capitalism in Russia, then global capitalism as an external, right? But this is exactly how he observed in Russia at that time, by that time. Market power was centralized, very few people. So it was monopoly capitalism. This was how Russian capitalism was defined at that time. So it was very becoming mature in terms of revolution because of this, in his view. The reason being, there are certain characteristics, right? All for economic reasons. There are contradictions within capitalism. Monopoly capitalism has its own contradictions, internal contradictions. Those internal contradictions are, there is a problem with finding markets. Okay? Monopoly capitalism having problem with finding markets internally. There is no sufficient market. And investment. Right? These few people that have centralized market power, they have finding problems with, right? Finding markets and investment opportunities. Right? So, because of this, imperialism comes. Because of this, monopoly capitalism and insufficient market, right? Problem, imperialism comes. Because imperialism is basically is an outlet for surplus capital. Surplus, right? This is contradiction. They have to find outside markets. Okay. This is how capitalist system becomes international. Right? So this is how the international capitalist system develops. Monopoly phase of capitalism. And there's a transition from capitalism to a higher system, which is, socialist. So imperialism converts, right, these outside colonies into a new proletariat, right, at a global level. This is the international capitalist system. Right? The international capitalist system, right, is divided into, right, and this leads to scholars who succeeded, right, as more developed theories, which is dependency theory. Dependency theory. Dependency theory developed in the 50s, 60s. Those were the peak times for dependency theory. Scholars who led dependency theory, economists in developing countries. Those were the scholars who led this dependence theory, mostly based in Latin America, in the 50s and 60s, Latin America, including the famous scholar Dos Santos, Andre Gunder Frank, big names in dependence theory, Andre Gunder Frank. The famous book written by him, Development of Underdevelopment. Right? Development of Underdevelopment, which seeks to explain, right, why underdevelopment is repeated in the developing world. Right? His contribution, his explanation why development repeated in the developing economy, based on previous, right, international capitalist theory, the reason why developing countries keep underdeveloped is because of this, as a result of colonization. So what is important, the real finding by these dependency scholars is that the cause for underdevelopment is to be found not in the internal, but external reason. That's the biggest finding, the biggest discovery. Liberal scholars, their explanation is the opposite. Liberal scholars point to the internal deficiencies in the developing economies. Why underdevelopment? Internally they are deficient. Their system is deficient. Their system itself is failing, or history itself is failing for them, right? But these scholars came out and contradict these liberal Western scholars' explanation, saying the reason, the cause is found in the colonization because of you. Right? This is a huge discovery at the time, a very challenging argument at the time. Um, so this kind of contradictory explanations still continue into the globalization time, right? Into the globalization time in the 1990s. Again, there was an argument that why globalization should be pushed, because these developing countries are still struggling. There are so many problems within the developing countries. They are not democracies. Markets are not, working, right? And there are dictators, right? They should not be left alone, right? Someone from the outside, get in and, right, take care of these guys, bad guys, right? There are so many bad guys in the developing countries, right? These so many bad guys don't have the right and the ability to rule their own country. That's liberals' view, Western view on the underdevelopment and the globalization. Why globalization, should be pushed. That's the reason. But again, right? The counter argument from the developing world is like this, right? Developing countries, yes, we have some problems, but main problem is you guys, Western, liberal policies don't help us, right? Same thing goes even today. So at that time, this was a huge discovery. And those who led this debate was dependency scholars. So Andre Gunder Frank is very big name, and more recently, not more recently, I mean he was maybe this guy also. There was another guy, which I haven't, maybe next slide. Raoul Prebisch, very famous guy. Prebisch, Raoul Prebisch. Again, economist from South and Latin American region, Raoul Prebisch. He was active in the 1950s. And again, his contribution as an economist is to show that developing economies are specializing in raw materials exports. That's his argument. Raoul Prebisch argues developing economies are specializing in the exports of raw materials. And advanced economies exports manufactured goods. And he shows quantitatively, right, if they exchange, right? Raw materials, manufactured goods are exchanged, right? These developing raw materials exporters always lose economically. And these manufactured goods exporters, they win. They get bigger benefits. That's Prebisch's contribution, Raoul Prebisch. Quantitatively, economically, he proved that, right? So, again, he made a big foundation for dependence theory, right? Why developing economies, developing countries are integrated into the global division of labor, right? Where they export raw materials and agricultural goods. They have no future, no hope for development. That's his contribution. So to escape this underdevelopment, what should they do? They have to withdraw from the global political economy and seek their own development strategy. Kim Jong-un, Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong-il, they might have read this. They are best examples of who follows, right? 100%. So this dependency theory develops into larger movement among the developing countries to become a movement towards new international economic order, NIEO, which appeared officially at the international stage in the 1970s, along with the rise of OPEC, right? Along with the rise of OPEC, along with the rise of non-aligned third world countries, right? Non-aligned meaning neither U.S. nor Soviet camp, right? So this is new international economic order, NIEO, which culminated in the 1970s. So we have Raul Prebisch here. Still, I mean, he's promoting this, Raul Prebisch, right, as a dependent scholar. He promoted NIEO movement, Raul Prebisch, okay? And he himself founded the new international agency under the UN, right? Under the arm of the United Nations. He was like a facilitating the foundation of a new international agency called UNCTAD, United Nations Committee on Trade and Development. Still exists. That was founded by this movement, this mood, right? Mood at that time, NIEO, and Raul Prebisch was very important. You might want to visit the site for this. They're still active, and they issue all kinds of data on. Their focus is on trade, right? Trade and the economic division of labor. How developing countries could develop using, reversing the trade structure. This is the focus, right? So it's different. I mean, they don't argue. People like Raul Prebisch, they don't argue these developing economies, they should withdraw from the trading system. They should remain, but trade structure should be changed in a way that improve so that development comes. This is why the name trade and development. And the statistics figure is the issue mostly, right? Along these lines. And still, as a scholar who first raised this sort of a key issue about development, like how developing economies grow when they export still raw materials. This is the, I think, long-standing academic and practical question for him. You know, when developing economies, when they are industrially, underdeveloped, how they could develop. That's the question for him. So, for development, for them, developing economy should get out of this resource trap. That's a big question, resource trap. Still, I think big part of the underdevelopment problem is revolving around this question. How developing economies should make a transition from this low value added, right, very primitive type of, right, either agricultural or raw materials production to higher stage manufacturing. Still, this is, this explains the big part of the underdevelopment problem. If you look around the developing world, mostly, underdevelopment, poverty is found in this, deficiency in the structure, industrial structure. And when industrial structure is like this, then could trade, international trade, right, improve this industrial structure? Well, I mean, Saudi and Iran, Iraq, or even Russia, many African countries, they are still in the resource driven sort of countries, and they have exported so many years enormous amount of natural gas and oil and other minerals, but their development still, right, doesn't I think right, expand. Still there. There's some cash, right, quick cash coming in, but that's it, right? Over time, longer term, there's no long-term development for them. So this is a big question. And Raul Prebisch, I mean, he was very insightful in that. Very insightful in pointing to this problem as part of the underdevelopment, right? He was very insightful in that. So this is a problem. Unfair trade structure. Unfair trade structure. So to improve development in the developing world, trade structure should be changed. Right? Manufacturing industry must be promoted in many developing countries, but it is difficult, very difficult. If you go, I was in Kazakhstan in February for 2 weeks. If you go to Kazakhstan, Kazakhstan is a very good example of why these developing economies are undergoing cycles of huge economic fluctuations. Right? Kazakhstan relatively wealthy from Central Asian standards or developing standards, like $15,000 per capita. But if you go to markets, grocery stores or department stores, from basic, very basic, industrial goods, even very simple things like orange juice or even clothes, right? Very fundamental basic goods they import. Very basic ones. Not to speak of electronic ones, like a TV, a little bit complex industrial manufactured goods, they don't have it. They import. Why? Because it's easy to earn money out of exporting oil and gas, right? So they extract it, export it, earn cash, pay for these simple goods by importing. And this structure is exactly what Raul Prebisch is trying to right? Reform. This I think forms the underdevelopment problems for Raul Prebisch. Kazakhstan, very good example. Many African countries, they don't have manufacturing basis. So without manufacturing basis, countless, exporting, countless trading relations don't lead to long-term economic growth. Real growth doesn't occur. And I agree. I mean, it's sad to say that longer term over the long run, Kazakhstan doesn't have a bright future. Like in many developing countries. It's a different thing, right? It's a different thing. Kazakhstan is in such a situation because the international structure is designed like that. It's a different thing to say that. But at least Kazakhstan, is very sad situation. So this NIEO, their goal was to redistribute power and income between this north and south, these two camps. Right? NIEO. And this leads further to more advanced theory, which is MWS, Modern World Systems Theory. Right? Modern World Systems Theory. Immanuel Wallerstein. He is the founder of this theory. Modern World Systems Theory. Immanuel Wallerstein, I think he still lives, still alive. He's still alive. He's teaching at State University of New York at Buffalo. SUNY at Buffalo. I think he's at the probably economics department. Oh, sociology department. He's at the sociology department, right? Modern World Systems Theory. Right. Very, in the 70s, the book title, I think the book title was this, Modern World Systems. And when he invented, I mean, it's so popular at that time, very popular, big name. One of big names in the social science history, right? And he was affected basically by Marxism and Leninism, and he's a successor to this Marxism, Leninism. And the uniqueness of his theory, he agrees with all the basics, okay? But his uniqueness, the things that make his theory unique, different from previous ones, is just this. He sort of make it more sophisticated. He make previous theories much more sophisticated, so that he divides the modern world system into three groups. That's his uniqueness. That's his contribution. Three groups. And each group has its own functional area and socio-economic characters. You know what? IPE is always about doing this, dividing countries based on certain criteria. IPE is always doing this, right? Remember, I mentioned the first class, the first session, that, you know, basically the big question is why certain countries are doing better than others economically, right? And in so doing, we need to divide, right? Look at different countries from different standards and criteria, right? Some countries have special type of capitalist systems, right? Western capitalist system, Asian capitalist system, right? Or Russian, Eastern European capitalist system. So always we divide, right? And group, classify different countries. This is exactly Immanuel Wallerstein was doing it. So he divided groups into three, like this. Core states. This was how it was written in the book. The book, his main object was European countries. What interested him was how European countries, you know, their economies work differently. Some economies are doing better. Some economic systems are much more efficient than others. Like Northwest European countries, those are core states. Those are core states. And in terms of functional role or socio-economic characters, they are industry-based, industry-centered. Those Northwest European countries, industry-based. Industry developed earlier than other regions. And he questions why industry first developed in Northwest Europe, then in Southwest Europe, or others, or Eastern European countries. Right? This is always we sort of tend to ask questions. And Eastern European countries, their socio-economic characters are agriculturally oriented somehow, for some reason. We don't know yet why. Right? But their systems are more agriculturally oriented. And this is how they are functioning, functional, right, roles. They provide agricultural goods. They export agricultural goods and import industrial products. And finally, semi-periphery. So these are three groups. Core, periphery. So he's the first scholar who used this term. Core, periphery. These are basic two groups, core, periphery. And semi-periphery. Semi-periphery is interesting. Regionally, Mediterranean countries are semi-group. Mediterranean Europe, right? And in terms of socio-economic functions, labor intensive, more service oriented. Service oriented. You might know. Where are you from? Holland. Holland. So, right? Very interesting observation. Very interesting observation. Right? And right. capitalism globally varies from country to country, right? Right. Capitalism varies. We don't know why capitalism manifests, in different forms. We don't know, right? Western type of capitalism, European type of capitalism, and Asian type of capitalism. Even within the Asian type of capitalism, Chinese capitalism. Chinese capitalism so different, right? Chinese capitalism. And I think IP, the basic goal of IP is to, study this variety of capitalism. Same thing here. But variety of capitalism within the boundary of Europe, in his case. But again, globally, right? You can ask many different, more interesting questions. There have been so many different books on this. Most outstanding contemporary book on this question. In other words, on this question of variety of capitalism. Most outstanding one lately is a book by Francis Fukuyama. The book, which has not been highlighted enough, the book he wrote about this question of capitalism from IP perspective, the book he wrote is No, that's not IP book. The IP book by Francis Fukuyama, capitalism book. Can you search the book? It's about trust. The way he cracks this puzzle of capitalism is from trust perspective. And he compares different capitalist systems in different countries. And he argues why certain capitalist economies are more efficient than others, better growing than others. He finds the answer in the question of trust. Very interesting book. Read it. Trust. More soft side, right? Italian capitalism. What's the title?
Trust, the social virtue and the creation of prosperity.
Yeah. When was it written?
95.
95. That's the book. Very interesting book. Why some European capitalist economies, Italian economy, is growing lower than others, is problem of lack of trust in Italian society. It's not having to do with, doesn't have nothing to do with sort of a global structural problem. But for him, more important thing is how society is working internally in terms of connecting to each other individually, whether people have trust with each other. So that's more important from Fukuyama's perspective than this global, sort of exploitation, things like that. So more internal problem for him. So problem of growth, economic growth and economic development, right, comes down to the problem of how you organize your own society. It's not global contradictions, it's internal contradictions. And internal contradictions more to do with lack of trust in some societies. So those economies growing better than others, those are socially more intensely connected, trust each other. That's Fukuyama's perspective. Again, Western, right? Western liberal perspective. I think Immanuel Wallerstein, he added some new features to the structuralism, right? Structuralist perspective, but he's still Marxist. He's still Marxist. His basic approaches are Marxist, right? In the sense that he looks at IP still in terms of class relation. If not class conflicts, still he looks at from class relations and patterns of exploitation. He still emphasizes exploitation, and class relations are important. So, to continue, core states, from Wallerstein's perspective, dominate the peripheral states. And core peripheral relations are unequal relationships. Right? And core states, right? Core states extract raw materials from periphery states. And this is something that I didn't understand clearly. But this is what is written in this chapter. The semi-periphery serves more of a political than an economic role. I'm not clear about this. Not clear. I don't know what this means. I don't know what this means. Within the European context, not sure what this means. So this, just remember, this is how was written in the textbook, but I'm not going to ask this again. Forget it. I don't know what that means. Maybe on a global scale, if you apply this theory to the global system, core states are advanced economies, right? Core states. Periphery states are developing poor countries, okay? Semi-periphery states are former Soviet economies. But after 1990, semi-periphery disappeared. Right? Semi-periphery disappeared. Not knowing where they went, not knowing. I mean, they have, gone into core group or periphery group, not yet. We don't know yet. Right? We have to still see what will happen. Like, for instance, Russia, they are not still, clearly in the core group, right? Nor in the periphery group. So still in the gray area. Many countries still in the gray area, right? Oh, this is forget it. This is what is written. Nation states are free to choose course of action or policies. I'm talking about, again, pages 122. Pages 122, last two paragraphs. A lot of ambiguity, last two paragraphs. And this sentence is from one of these two paragraphs. And there was a discussion about Immanuel Wallerstein. He discusses, the role of nation states. sovereignty issues. A lot of ambiguity about this, but at the end of the day, still Immanuel Wallerstein, for him, I think this is something that we need to sort of remember. Nation states are powerless in the global economic system. Okay. So in this sense, I think he's not realist. Right? This is the difference between realism and structuralism. Nation states are powerless, right? And they are not free to choose the course of their own development, right? So in that sense, I think Wallerstein is very pessimistic, and he's very deterministic. Deterministic. You know what? The title of this chapter, what is the title of this chapter? In the very beginning of this chapter, what's the title? Economic development and exploitation, right? Economic determinism. Economic determinism. Wallerstein is deterministic. Wallerstein deterministic. So structuralists are deterministic. Right? One thing that characterizes structuralism is determinism and exploitation. This is what it means. Nation states, they are not free to choose their own course of development. What does this mean? This means global structure have a huge constraint on nation states. This is structuralism. And on this, Wallerstein agrees. He doesn't give much freedom to individual nation states. Governments, very small room to move around because structure, global structure is so powerful in constraining. So in that sense, I think he's very deterministic. So these two paragraphs on page 122 discusses that. Although a lot of ambiguity and a lot of difficult to understand, but at the end of the day, the whole point of these two paragraphs is exactly about this, determinism. Now, then we are getting closer to the 1990s, the 80s, 90s, and 2000, global financial crisis. This may be more important than previous ones. According to this textbook, IPE after 1975 is better explained by neo-imperialism rather than liberalism, rather than mercantilism, obviously. Better explained by neo-imperialism. Or to put it differently, IPE after 1975 takes the form of imperialism. Maybe that's the better way of putting it. We have to think about it. Reviewing some events like a 75, when we discussed liberalism, we began with the energy crisis, right? 73 energy crisis. Then there were two waves of energy crisis. 79, the second wave of energy crisis. Then the U.S. President Carter was in power. Then in the 80s, President Reagan, right? The Soviet, troubles, 1990 Soviet Union collapse, right? And all these, we need to revisit all these events in international history from either imperialist or neo-imperialist perspectives. Right? Can you explain like energy crisis in 1973 or the rise of OPEC? Can you explain it from neo-imperialist perspective? So at graduate school in America, when you go to graduate school, this is how professors write questions, essay questions. Give same events and give you a choice of maybe a couple of approaches in IP and instructs us to compare and contrast on the same events using different approaches. Right? The Soviet collapse, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, how would you explain the collapse of the Soviet Union from neo-imperialism? Maybe I can ask that question in the essay, as an essay question. How would you explain the collapse of the Soviet Union from neo-imperialism? Or Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, 1979. Or US support to Taliban in the 1980s. America was behind Taliban, Mujahideen, right? They were friends in the 80s. Although they later became enemies, but initially they were friends. So how would you explain US campaign in Afghanistan in the 80s from imperialist perspective? Or Iran-Iraqi war. Iran-Iraqi war in the 80s. Okay. So many different events, like so many different events that must be reassessed from neo-imperialist perspective. Neo-imperialism, by the way, neo-imperialism is this more subtle type of imperialism. So no material force involved. Imperialism, traditional imperialism, using force, okay, and occupying territory, real physical occupation of territory. That's imperialism, traditional imperialism. But in neo-imperialism, there is no physical occupation of territory. You don't need to go there. You control it maybe remotely. That's neo-imperialism. You control it remotely, but the control is even stronger, right? Stronger and nicer, much nicer. That's neo-imperialism. And those who are ruled don't recognize whether they are ruled. That's neo-imperialism, right? Much more nicer, complicated, sophisticated, right? Best form of neo-imperialism, U.S. control. U.S. control. So U.S. is neo-imperialist, best example of neo-imperialist power. Because they are nicer, right? And although they have many troops station in many countries, but still neo-imperialist, because they are not, they are different from British colonial policy. American policy in the 20th century different from British policy in the 19th century, or German, or Dutch. We have Dutch people from Holland here. Dutch. This European imperialist power, US power, qualitatively different. This is how America is trying to show. So American control is neo-imperialism, although America doesn't use the term, right? The critics use that term. So America is neo-imperialism, British, European is imperialism. So there's no physical occupation involved. Two famous scholars, neo-imperialist scholars, Harry Magdoff and John Bellamy Foster, two big names, neo-imperialist scholar. The journal they publish are this journal, Monthly Review. Monthly Review, very famous journal. These global institutions, they are in the front line of this neo-imperialist policy. They are tools. Vietnam War, from neo-imperialist perspective, through Vietnam War was America trying to get access to natural resources. This is how neo-imperialism views Vietnam War, because of raw materials. Again, in the 80s, so many different events that must be looked at differently from neo-imperialism. Carter Doctrine. Carter Doctrine is about the Middle East, Persian Gulf. Again, oil and gas in the Persian Gulf. That's what the Carter Doctrine is about. Same thing as in the Vietnam War. Iranian Revolution, same thing. 1979, Mujahideen in Afghanistan, everything must be looked at it differently. Reagan was most vocal, right, in intervening developing countries, okay, developing countries. Although the cover at that time for Reagan was, again, promote democracy in the developing economy. Promote democracy and market economies. That's the cover. But, right, in reality, it was neo-imperialist motives. Particularly Reagan administration was very active in, right, intervening in South America. Right? Lots of things happened in South America. Guatemala, Nicaragua, those countries. Iran-Iraqi war again. Iran-Iraqi war. And the big thing about particularly the Middle East, Persian Gulf, was to control everything. Comes down to controlling oil and gas and assistance to Western oil corporations in the Middle East. '90s, Clinton administration. Again, same thing. The fall of the Soviet Union, right, maybe strengthened imperialist policy. Then the textbook discusses right? What happened? Unipolar moment. There was a lot of debate about how America can seize the unipolar moment. And some even argue that American empire, right, without the Soviet Union. Right? The neoconservatives came around. Gulf War in 1991, right? Again, the same thing, right? From imperialist perspective, all these events can be looked at from this, right, perspectives. Penetrate developing economies through different tools, trade, investment, liberal policy, democracy, and all these. And make them dependent on America. Washington Consensus, which we mentioned earlier. Those policies, again, the goal was to penetrate developing economies. And these financial institutions, they are fronts. We cover this later. Then there was some discussion about how the Clinton administration is different from Reagan administration. Okay, you need to take note of that. The neo-imperialist policy under Clinton. Okay, according to the book, less overtly interventionist under Clinton, but still the slogan was, quote unquote, engagement and enlargement under Clinton. Right? And Reagan was active in South America, Clinton in Africa. Clinton administration in Africa. So you go ahead and read it. Last section about global financial crisis. Again, global financial crisis in 2007. There's a lot of discussion about it, but how can we view it from neo-imperialism, right? Apply structuralism to global financial crisis. One quick question. How does this textbook answer this question? How can we view the global financial crisis from structuralist perspective? What does this textbook say? Remember, structuralist perspective. How do we begin in analyzing the global financial crisis from structuralist perspective? How do we begin? Remember how Lenin analyzed. Capitalism in the early 20th century. Early 21st century. Capitalism in the early 21st century. Right? 100 years later. How capitalism changed. Then early 20th century, these capitalist contradictions led to revolutions, right? Socialist revolutions in many different countries, and finally led to global war, World War I, World War II. 21st century. 21st century, we have these huge changes in the capitalist system. I don't know how epochal that 2007 global financial crisis, but I think it must be huge, although we have to see maybe some years down the road, right? But at least we don't have a war like World War I, World War II. But at least capitalism, something going wrong, like in the 20th century, early 20th century, right? The way this textbook views is that there is contradiction within the American capitalism. That's how he begins, right? Like Lenin looked at Russian capitalism, right? What happened? What was happening in the Russian capitalism, early 20th century? Concentration of economic power, monopoly capitalism. What was happening in the American capitalism? Concentration of wealth in small number of people, right? He's using different figures. How much percentage of U.S. population, right, monopolize the entire wealth in the American economy. That's how this textbook views. So there is internal contradiction in the American capitalism, right? Maybe what he was getting at was because of this internal contradiction, right? U.S. capitalism was trying to find market outside the United States. Right? There is no sufficient market in the U.S. There is surplus capital. Right? This surplus capital always looking for outlets for profits. Right? So this maybe encourage it, Wall Street, U.S. policymakers to make very aggressive, right, liberal, global campaign, globalization campaign. Okay. Thursday, chapter 5.